The next chapter in the story of Donkey Kong has just been written this month with the wildly successful and critically acclaimed release of Donkey Kong Bananza. But the story of Donkey Kong began a staggering 45 years ago and involves some of the most legendary figures of gaming history and their work on over 40 different Donkey Kong titles. Some of which were smash hits, and some which never even saw the light of day. So come along with me as we explore the complete history of Donkey Kong. But first, my very talented daughter has created this one-of-a-kind, handmade DK plush, and she's insisted that we give it away to one lucky viewer. So stick around to the very end of the video and we'll tell you how you can enter to win. It'll be super easy, I promise. We begin in the year 1980 and Nintendo is teetering on the edge of disaster. Their latest arcade game Radar Scope has crashed and burned in North America. Thousands of unsold machines clog warehouses and the company's American branch is hemorrhaging cash. Failure looms large as the company's 80s heyday with breakthrough hits like Super Mario Bros. Is still half a decade away. But Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo's no-nonsense president, isn't about to let his company sink. With his best developers busy, he taps an untested rookie, Shigeru Miyamoto, a young artist with zero gaming experience. His task would be to salvage the Radar Scope fiasco by building something new, something bold. Radar Scope had been an arcade space shooter game developed by Nintendo and released in late 1979. Inspired by the success of games like Space Invaders, it featured fast-paced gameplay and colorful graphics. In Japan, it enjoyed moderate popularity, which encouraged Nintendo to take a big swing at the growing US arcade market. In 1980, the company shipped thousands of Radar Scope arcade cabinets to the United States, hoping to establish a foothold overseas. Unfortunately, Radar Scope landed in the US at the wrong time. You see, by 1980, American arcade gamers were pretty tired of repetitive space shooters and craving fresh, innovative experiences. Radar Scope didn't deliver, and its lackluster reception left Nintendo of America with a warehouse full of unsold machines. The financial hit was severe. Nintendo had poured significant resources into production and shipping, and the failure threatened the ongoing viability of its US operations, led by Minoru Arakawa, who had reached out to his Japanese counterparts begging for a way to convert the machines into something that would sell. Enter young Mr. Miyamoto, who lived just across the river from Nintendo's Japanese office. He tells his friends, "You probably won't hear from me for about 2 or 3 months." But the work stretches even longer than that. Originally starting life as a Popeye game, the team encountered issues with the use of Popeye characters, and they were instead able to pivot to a strange story about a love triangle between a carpenter, his girlfriend, and his pet gorilla, who is of course the titular Donkey Kong. Why Donkey Kong? Well, the Kong part is simple. Miyamoto was inspired by the influential King Kong franchise. Incidentally, King Kong vs. Godzilla had been a huge blockbuster hit in 1962 and quickly became the highest-grossing Japanese-produced movie of all time. Unfortunately, using Kong in the name would prove contentious as Universal City Studios decided later on to sue Nintendo. This was a little bit of a bizarre lawsuit because in an earlier case, Universal themselves had argued that King Kong had entered the public domain, enabling them to make films using the character. Nintendo's lawyer John Kirby argued exactly that, and the judge was convinced. In case you're wondering, yes, the famous Kirby who would be created years later was indeed named as a special thanks to lawyer Kirby's success in this case, defending the company in this vulnerable phase in its history. But I digress. As for Donkey, there have been various theories over the years, including one that it's a misspelling of the word monkey with the M replaced by a D, but the reality was recounted by Miyamoto in a 2001 interview where he said, "Back when we made Donkey Kong, Mario was just called Jumpman and he was a carpenter. That's because the game was set on a construction site, so that made sense. When we went on to make the game Mario Brothers, we wanted to use pipes, maybe a sewer in the game, so he became a plumber. For Donkey Kong, I wanted to use something to do with Kong, which kind of gives the idea of apes in Japanese, and I came up with Donkey Kong because I heard that donkey meant stupid, so I went with Donkey Kong. Unfortunately, when I said the name to Nintendo of America, nobody liked it, and they said that it didn't mean stupid ape, and they all laughed at me. But we went ahead with that name anyway." So Nintendo of America had their game, and the 2,000 or so mothballed Radar Scope cabinets were hurriedly salvaged and converted to Donkey Kong units. These sold out almost immediately, and Nintendo of America's Arakawa ordered more and more from Japan. Soon it became impossible to ship enough machines from overseas to keep up with demand, and Nintendo of America was expanded to begin manufacturing the components themselves. Within the next couple of years, Donkey Kong arcade machines alone made Nintendo of America around $1 billion adjusted for 2025 inflation, the profits from which were used to purchase 27 acres of land in Redmond, Washington, building a massive new headquarters that remains home to the company to this day. It's amazing to think that all the success that Nintendo of America, and to a large extent Nintendo itself, has achieved over all these years began with a silly stupid ape, his carpenter owner, and a young creative genius who was just getting started. Given the success of the Donkey Kong arcade game, Nintendo rightly recognized that there was a big opportunity to reach even more gamers by porting the game to other platforms. But remember, these were still early days for Nintendo in the home video game space. They dabbled with the color TV game series in the late 70s, but the NES was still years away. Versions were created for the ColecoVision and Atari 2600, which were hugely successful, but Nintendo wanted something they could call their own, with a little more vertical integration and less reliance on partner corporations. They did have one option in this regard, the Game & Watch. Originally released in 1980, the Game & Watch handhelds had proven to be a fairly popular Nintendo product, with some games like Vermin and Manhole even eclipsing 1 million copies in sales. And so Nintendo began the ambitious development of Game & Watch Donkey Kong. The plan was to leverage the same vertical multi-screen technology as Oil Panic, which was in development at the same time, but with one key addition, a high-tech, innovative cross-shaped directional pad. This would be the first time Nintendo would ever feature a D-pad on their products, and it was actually one of the first ever implemented successfully on any gaming device. Just looking at the thing side by side with a Nintendo DS, which released more than a full 2 decades later, is quite an amazing thing to behold. The handheld was an enormous success, selling 8 million copies, nearly as many as the 19 preceding Game & Watch games combined. While somewhat rudimentary and limited compared to a full-scale arcade cabinet or even a home TV console, Donkey Kong's Game & Watch proved to Nintendo that there was a bigger consumer base than once thought for portable gaming, something they'd capitalize on in a big way later in the decade. At the same time as the Game & Watch port was being developed, Nintendo was also working on an arcade sequel. In an intriguing twist, this time the villainous Donkey Kong would actually be the protagonist. Or that was the plan anyway, though it soon became clear that the DK sprite was just way too big and unwieldy to make for a fun and engaging platforming game. The gameplay demanded a smaller sprite, so Miyamoto had a stroke of brilliance. The game's story would revolve around a trapped and defeated Donkey Kong, and you, the player, who take on the role of the ape's son, must rescue your father from the clutches of Mario. In this way, the game acted as a sequel of sorts to the first title, but with a delightful twist that changed up and refreshed the game in both story as well as gameplay elements. New enemies were added, and Donkey Kong Jr. could climb up and down vines. Graphics were a lot more interesting compared to the first game as well, and arcade goers were delighted. Donkey Kong Jr. garnered considerable critical acclaim, winning multiple awards, and was even included in Twin Galaxy's first ever official Video Game World Championship, which aired on ABC's That's Incredible in 1983. To develop the game, Nintendo decided that this time they were going to go it alone and develop the entire game in-house. This was in contrast to the first Donkey Kong, where they contracted manufacturer Ikegami to do some of the programming work. Ikegami was not pleased to hear this and claimed that Nintendo was ripping off the code that they created for the first game. Nintendo countered that as a mere contractor, Ikegami did not have any ownership rights over the code. The legal case that ensued dragged on for a long time, eventually being settled in 1990 with Nintendo paying an undisclosed amount. Legal issues aside, Donkey Kong Jr. was a worthy successor and proved a commercial success. It even inspired a Saturday morning cartoon that ran alongside a separate Donkey Kong show in 1983. The second Donkey Kong arcade game resulted in, of course, another Game & Watch port. Doing away with the D-pad, this second entry in the DK Game & Watch series did innovate in other ways. Most notably, this was the debut of the so-called new widescreen, a format that would be used for many other Game & Watch titles like Super Mario Bros. And Balloon Fight in 1988. The game featured much the same gameplay mechanics as the arcade version, such as jumping over enemies, climbing vines, and ultimately grabbing a key to save Donkey Kong. And while it didn't match the first Game & Watch in sales, it was nevertheless a profitable little side project for Nintendo. Yet another Game & Watch game kicked off the 1983 entries in the series, Donkey Kong 2. Similar to the first handheld entry, this one reverted to the dual screen with the D-pad configuration. In this one, there are a lot more obstacles in your way. The challenging gameplay involves grabbing a key on the bottom screen and avoiding the electrical sparks, climbing the vines up to the top screen where you can save DK. Doing so starts everything all over again, but this time everything's moving quicker, providing a greater challenge and enhancing replayability. After the hugely encouraging results of Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. in the arcades, it was only natural for Nintendo to want to follow up with a third game. Interestingly, this one released after the NES console came out in Japan, a revolutionary device that ushered in the gradual but unavoidable end of the arcade era. In fact, as it turned out, this would be the final time Nintendo's famous ape would be seen in arcades for the whole rest of the 20th century. It probably also didn't help that sales of the third game, at least in North America, were poor. Some criticized the radical departure from the first two, completely shifting genres to a shoot-'em-up and even replacing Mario with a relatively unknown Game & Watch hero named Stanley the Bugman. But what really killed the game in the States was the infamous video game crash of 1983. We'll save the details of that particular dark chapter in our beloved industry for another video, but suffice it to say that the early to mid-1980s were just not a good time to release any kind of game in America. As for the game itself, as mentioned, you control Stanley as you seek to defend your greenhouse from an invading Donkey Kong along with a swarm of insects. Armed with bug spray, Stanley repels or defeats enemies by spraying them, pushing Donkey Kong upward while eliminating the pests. Power-ups like super spray cans occasionally appear, boosting his spray's strength briefly to tackle tougher enemy waves. As levels progress, the pace quickens and insect numbers grow, demanding sharp timing and movement. And so victory requires balancing Donkey Kong's position while clearing the relentless aerial onslaught. It was a fun little twist on arcade shoot-'em-ups and picked up a small cult following, with the current world record sitting at just over 3.5 million points, set by George Riley way back in 2011. And that's all I'm gonna say about Donkey Kong world records in this video because, well, I don't want any trouble, and I can't afford a lawsuit or anything so early in my channel's life. Moving right along. Although the original Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. had been ported to the system earlier in the year, you might be surprised to learn that the first ever Donkey Kong game to be developed specifically for the NES was Donkey Kong Jr. Math, an edutainment game that was panned by critics and has largely been forgotten to time. A little bit of an ignominious start for the first Donkey Kong game made for a Nintendo home console. Luckily though, there will be plenty more to come that'll more than make up for it. In the game, players control Donkey Kong Jr. working to solve simple math problems by navigating vines and platforms to collect numbers and math symbols. There's a two-player feature, where the second player controls a pink version of Jr., and multiple game modes allow for different types of challenge. It was designed by Toshihiko Nakago, who despite the failure of Donkey Kong Jr. Math, would go on to have a long and storied career at Nintendo with dozens of credits to his name. However, this would be the last time he'd ever work on a Donkey Kong title. In 1984, Sega was a rising force in the arcade scene, publishing Konami's Frogger and even creating the first ever internationally released game with isometric graphics, called Zaxxon. So it wasn't all that surprising to hear that they secured a license from Nintendo to create their own game featuring Donkey Kong as a playable character. Strangely, DK was to be cast as a parking attendant, which hints at a likely departure from the platforming action of the first two arcade games, possibly leaning towards more of a puzzle or strategy style. Those specifics remain elusive to this day because of course the game never ended up being released. See, in 1984, Sega underwent a significant transition when its leaders David Rosen and Hayao Nakayama arranged a management buyout from Gulf and Western Industries, who had owned Sega since 1969. This shift in ownership led to the cancellation of the Donkey Kong game, leaving it as a what could have been in the annals of video game lore. Could a quirky Sega parking attendant DK have led to further partnerships, even resulting in a permanent truce that prevented the console wars of the 90s? We'll never know for sure, but it's certainly fun to speculate. 3 more Game & Watch games round out 1984 that we'll go through quickly, and indeed this would be it for Donkey Kong for the entire rest of the 80s. The Game & Watch games really were big bang for the buck investments for the company, but one can only imagine that releasing so many in such rapid succession had to have had some impact on sales due to cannibalization. You also want to be careful with brand dilution and consumer expectations around quality, a lesson Nintendo will relearn around 20 years later. But I guess there just wasn't an appetite to take a risk on another full-scale game at this point after the failures of DK3 and the Math one on the NES. Anyway, the first of these 3 Game & Watch games was Donkey Kong Circus, a juggling game where you would move Donkey Kong back and forth on a barrel trying to catch pineapples. The game is essentially a reskin of a Mickey Mouse game that came out earlier in the year. Both games are part of the unique and innovative Panorama line of Game & Watch titles with color graphics projected onto a mirror. But the most interesting thing about this game is it's actually the first time you could play as Donkey Kong in a game. Remember, in Donkey Kong Jr., DK wasn't a playable character, only his son was. After this one, and Donkey Kong Hockey later in the year, gamers wouldn't be able to take on the role directly of the famous ape himself again until 10 full years later with 1994's Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo. In '84, Nintendo released 3 quite unique and fascinating Game & Watch games that they called the Micro Versus series, which featured 2 controllers for competitive multiplayer fun. The first was an unrelated boxing game, but the other 2 make our list as we continue our journey through the ages of Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong 3 was a Micro Versus game that puts a fun PvP spin on the arcade Donkey Kong 3, with one player taking on the role of Donkey and the other playing as Stanley. DK needs to spray pesticide at insects to push them towards Stanley, while Stanley has to do his best to repel them. If he fails, they'll get all the way to him and sting him. It's basically a little bit more interesting version of Pong, but as an affordable multiplayer Donkey Kong experience, Nintendo thought there was an audience for it. Unfortunately, likely mostly due to the lack of success of the arcade version, the Donkey Kong 3 Game & Watch game did not sell as well as hoped. And so we come to it, the final Donkey Kong game of the 80s. I wish I could tell you it was a classic, befitting the end of an era, but instead it's my duty to inform you that this first phase of the Donkey Kong story ends with a mere whimper. Yet another glorified Pong game, Donkey Kong Hockey involves one player playing as Donkey Kong and the other as Mario, and the two essentially just hit a puck back and forth, trying to score on each other. There are a couple minor things that spice things up just a tiny bit, such as an extra fast hit if you manage to time a button press at the right moment, and some moving obstacles in the middle that change the trajectory of the puck. But other than that, it pretty much is what it is. Donkey Kong Hockey retailed for around $40, which doesn't sound like that much, but with inflation, that's around $125. The absolute state of 1984 gaming. But considering when the NES came out in North America the following year, an average game cost $50, with the console itself costing another $180 for a combined $700 adjusted for inflation, at least Donkey Kong Hockey was just a little bit more accessible to those with lower budgets. Be that as it may, consumers just couldn't justify spending big bucks on what seemed like a fairly played out franchise at the time, especially with the spin-off Mario rising to prominence. And so Nintendo pivoted to focus on their new mascot, leaving the ape that had made them a household name to gather dust for the next decade. Or did they? As it turned out, Nintendo did not drop Donkey Kong entirely. Actually, they worked on another game in the mid-80s, The Return of Donkey Kong. We don't have a whole lot of remaining materials, but there are official confirmations that the game was at least conceptualized. For example, an official Nintendo Player's Guide in 1987 mentions the game, seeming to indicate that barrel throwing could be a mechanic, and that players could take control of Donkey Kong himself as a playable character. The news page of the Nintendo Fan Club magazine provided pretty much the same info, albeit using a little bit more colorful language. The first announcement we have of the game's cancellation was published in Computer Entertainer magazine in May 1988, where they confirmed that Nintendo will not be releasing the game that year as previously planned. Unfortunately, we really don't have much else on this would-be late 80s Return of the King. Instead, yet again, we're left to wonder what could have been. And who knows, maybe it's for the best. After all, we've still got a long way to go as we finally make our way into the 1990s. The very first attempt at reviving Donkey Kong in the 90s was interestingly not even on a Nintendo console. As we've covered a few other times on this channel, in the 90s Nintendo was working with Philips together on a CD add-on for the SNES. The partnership fell through before the product could be delivered, and Nintendo was so soured on the optical disc technology that they wouldn't revisit it again until years later with the GameCube. But as part of the deal, Philips at least took home a consolation prize, the rights to use some Nintendo characters in some of their games for their own console, the CDI. And so, Philips hired unknown developers Rydell Software Productions to create a Donkey Kong game that would release alongside 3 Zelda games and Hotel Mario, titles that appeared on our list of 90s flops if you want to learn more about them. But the Donkey Kong game never got the chance to flop because it was ultimately cancelled before they could finish it. As for Rydell Software Productions, they would go on to rebrand as Running with Scissors, becoming famous, or perhaps infamous, for their Postal series. The start of the real 90s revival of Donkey Kong came the following year with Donkey Kong for the Game Boy. Critically acclaimed and financially successful, this game is a puzzle platformer that builds on elements from the original arcade series. The story is familiar. Players guide Mario as he seeks to rescue Pauline from Donkey Kong, a nostalgic nod that longtime fans appreciated. The game even began with the classic arcade levels, but it soon expanded into new levels with novel puzzles. Puzzle levels are broken up with the addition of battle levels every 4th level, where you can defeat Donkey Kong by using his own barrels against him. With over 100 levels to play, there's plenty to explore in this first attempt to create an original new DK game on a handheld. We're going to take a little bit of a detour here for a second for an interesting little sideshow, because in the late 80s and early 90s, Nelsonic Industries, who gained some notoriety by manufacturing fully licensed playable video game watches, made a deal with Nintendo to bring some of their most iconic titles to a tiny wearable format. They did Super Mario Bros. 3, Tetris, and even Super Mario World and Star Fox. But the final ever Nintendo game they'd make a Game Watch for was none other than Donkey Kong. The Donkey Kong Game Watch plays similar to a Game & Watch game, with a tiny LCD screen overlaid with some static elements. Nelsonic would discontinue Game Watches shortly after this one, as gamers had mostly moved on to the much more advanced handhelds that had become available, like the Game Boy. Between 2018 and 2022, there were a series of massive data leaks at Nintendo that became known as the Nintendo Giga Leak. Among the data leaked were official documents, ROMs of games and demos, source codes, and prototype designs, among many other interesting things. One especially interesting thing that they found was a prototype version of 1995's Yoshi's Island. The game didn't feature Yoshi though, instead the main character seemed to be a strange Mario sprite. Of interest to us though is that the name of the game at that time was Super Donkey, and though he doesn't appear directly in the playable prototype, a sprite of Donkey Kong exists in the files, and that makes it pretty certain that this game would have acted as a sort of sequel to Donkey Kong, where you play as Mario and face off against your pet ape nemesis at the end. Of course, the game never released as Super Donkey, and there's every reason to believe that it was retooled and eventually did become Yoshi's Island. Nintendo had something else in mind for DK's first appearance on the Super Nintendo. The release of Donkey Kong Country in 1994 began a second golden age for the franchise. The game was so successful that apart from the very first arcade title and its many ports and re-releases, Country is the best-selling Donkey Kong game in the entire franchise, even to this day, a fact that may or may not remain true by the time I publish this video, but we'll get to that later. Just to set the stage a little, remember that in the early 90s, the video game world was locked in a battle of two titans, Nintendo with their Super Nintendo and Sega with their Genesis. Sega was off to a good start and actually had a slight edge in America, while Nintendo had a slight lead in Japan. In '93, the huge movie tie-in Aladdin hit both systems, with the SNES version doing pretty well but being completely blown out of the water by the Genesis version that outsold it by more than double. Nintendo was looking to hit back in a big way. They needed to show that they could still compete, and they wanted a title that showcased some real ingenuity to make it clear that the Super Nintendo could still hold its own graphically. And so Nintendo turned to an old ally, Rare, a British studio founded by the visionary Stamper brothers Tim and Chris, who had worked with Nintendo on various successful NES titles like Battletoads and Wizards and Warriors. Back in 1992, Rare had made waves by shelling out a fortune, around $250,000 per unit, for SGI Challenge workstations paired with Alias rendering software. Now these weren't just fancy toys, they were Hollywood-grade machines used to make special effects for blockbuster movies. This investment vaulted Rare to the very top of the food chain for UK or even global developers. "We were playing with fire," Tim Stamper once said, "but we knew we could set the industry ablaze. We wanted to blow the SNES wide open, and those workstations were our ticket." To show they were really serious, Nintendo purchased a 25% equity in Rare, a share they'd gradually increase all the way to 49%. Their big idea was to create a platformer game with pre-rendered 3D graphics, something that, if they pulled it off, would be truly stand out and catapult Super Nintendo to the very front of the pack in terms of graphics. And pull it off they did. The game's graphics received unanimous critical acclaim, with all agreeing that a new industry standard had been set. Writing for Entertainment Weekly, Bob Strauss said, "Donkey Kong Country is to most 16-bit games what most 16-bit games are to their Atari forebears. Once you've played it, everything else before it seems like a peewee." Right alongside praise for the graphics, though, was equal praise for the game's incredible soundtrack composed by David Wise. Wise was no stranger to video game music. He'd begun working at Rare years before when he was hired on the spot by Tim and Chris Stamper after demoing a Yamaha synthesizer for them while working in a music shop. Imagine, you're working at a retail store when two guys come in saying, "Hey, we make video games out of our barn and we were trying to figure out how to make some music. Can you show us how?" And then when you show them, they're like, "Hey, you really seem to know what you're doing. Want to come work in our barn and make songs for our games?" And that's pretty much exactly what happened, but Wise went along with it, a decision that changed the shape of video game music forever. Still, he was surprised when entrusted by Nintendo with a game as important to the company as Donkey Kong Country, and endeavored to turn around a score unlike anything heard before. To this day, Aquatic Ambiance and other songs from the game are remembered by fans of both synthetic music and video games with a sort of solemn admiration that's usually reserved only for influential mainstream bands like the Beatles. The story and characters were also fresh and exciting, introducing the evil King K. Rool and his army of crocodiles who steal the Kong's hoard of bananas, leaving Donkey Kong and his friends and family, including Diddy Kong, Cranky Kong, and Funky Kong, to seek to recover their bananas and defeat these dastardly kremlings. Not exactly Shakespeare, but a hugely influential story nonetheless for how it completely rebooted the character and drastically expanded the Kong universe. The gameplay also innovated with unique platforming elements, including the iconic minecarts, cannon barrels, and even rideable animal pals that each had different special abilities. Apart from collecting bananas, players could also go for an extra challenge of hunting down the 4 letters spelling out Kong in each level, plus a special balloon and golden animal tokens, all of which had the ability to grant you extra lives. And you might just need them too, because Donkey Kong Country was no slouch when it came to challenging gameplay. Thinking back, Miyamoto himself, who had stepped back and handed over the reins to a mainline DK title to someone else for the first time ever, remarked that Rare breathed new life into Donkey Kong. I couldn't have done it better. And that is perhaps the highest praise the game could have received, and an excellent way to start a new era. While Donkey Kong Country was taking the world by storm on Nintendo's home console, they certainly didn't forget about the Game Boy. Originally planned as a mere port of Donkey Kong Country, Donkey Kong Land's lead programmer Paul Makachek instead convinced Rare to create a whole new original game. Still featuring pre-rendered graphics, many of the gameplay elements of Country, and even an adapted version of David Wise's soundtrack, Donkey Kong Land would forge its own path and give gamers a good reason to buy the game even if they were already enjoying its bigger brother on the SNES. As it turned out, Makachek was right, as the sales of Donkey Kong Land, almost 4 million copies, prove without a doubt. The story begins in the game's instruction booklet, where Cranky Kong breaks the fourth wall by challenging DK and Diddy Kong to recreate the success of Donkey Kong Country but on 8-bit hardware, proving that the gameplay mechanics and overall fun of the newly revived franchise is what gamers really want, not just fancy visuals. This hilarious bit of self-insertion by the developers accomplishes 2 things. It sets the player up for a light-hearted romp where the stakes aren't all that high, but the fun factor is cranked up to 10, and it also lets you know that hey, this isn't just Donkey Kong Country on a smaller screen, it really is something truly distinct. Donkey Kong Land features 30 levels across 4 worlds with unique level themes like cliffs and clouds, and introduces new enemies like flying pigs along with bosses not seen in Donkey Kong Country. The gameplay is adapted for the Game Boy with simpler controls and less complex interactions, making it more suitable for handheld play. Examples of this include requiring only a jump to grab onto climbing ropes and tapping A to move higher while swimming. The game was loved by players and critics, and set the franchise up for successful sequels throughout the mid-90s. Speaking of sequels, immediately following the launch of Donkey Kong Country, the team got started working on a follow-up. This work began even before the first entry on the Super Nintendo had been proven a commercial success, so there was still some uncertainty but a lot of belief in what Rare and Nintendo had both considered a solid product. Called Diddy's Conquest, not Diddy Kong's Quest as many believe to this day, a forgivable error if you ask me. Donkey Kong Country 2 shifted focus to the sidekick Diddy Kong and his girlfriend Dixie as they embark on a quest to save DK as he's been kidnapped by King K. Rool, restyled Captain K. Rool to match the game's heavy pirate theme. The new Dixie character really changed up the gameplay of the game, with her mechanic of floating using her ponytail adding a new sort of challenge to platforming. Apparently dozens of different names were considered for Dixie, like Ducky, Dippy, Dizzy, Dolly, and Dandy. Finally they landed on Diddy Ann, but luckily made a last-minute switch instead to Dixie, and for longtime fans of the series it's hard to imagine her with any other name. David Wise returned to provide yet another fantastic soundtrack, and the graphics one-upped even the game-changing visuals of the first Donkey Kong Country. Critical response was of course stellar, and to absolutely nobody's surprise, the game was a hit, selling millions of copies, though it never did quite match the first 16-bit entry in sales. Taking another short detour, a lot of people seem to think that Nintendo skipped 32-bit consoles altogether, moving from the 16-bit Super Nintendo straight to the N64, but they did create one 32-bit console, the flawed and mostly forgotten Virtual Boy. Given the meteoric phoenix rising of Donkey Kong in the mid-90s, you might think it's strange that the Virtual Boy didn't feature our cherished Stupid Ape. But did you know that Rare actually did begin working on a Virtual Boy Donkey Kong game? As revealed by Rare graphics and character artist Steve Hurst in a 2017 interview with Digital Foundry, I was kind of drafted on to help program and just look and see what was possible on Virtual Boy. So I ended up taking some of the sprites that had been done for the Game Boy version and put them into the Virtual Boy. But according to Hurst, the game would have taken a lot of work to finish due to the effective duplication of effort needed to create the full 3D graphics of a Virtual Boy game. This, combined with the failure at launch of the console itself, ensured that the game never made it very far into development. This is a bit of a shame too, because as Hurst recalls, the effect we had was very good. We managed to get a very solid looking game. Back in the realm of more traditional portable systems that were actually portable in a practical sense, unlike the doomed Virtual Boy, a completely different team at Rare had been working on the next chapter for the Game Boy. Donkey Kong Land 2 came out in 1996. Unlike the first Donkey Kong Land, this second game didn't shy away from its Super Nintendo counterpart, instead fully embracing it and even following the same storyline. World themes and even the names of the stages were copied directly from Diddy's Conquest, though level designs did necessarily differ somewhat due to the differences in screen sizes, gameplay mechanics, and graphics that were possible on a Game Boy. The game got generally favorable review scores and ended up selling between 1 and 2 million copies, making this another success for the Kongs in their prime. Fun fact, like its predecessor, Donkey Kong Land 2 was held on a banana yellow cartridge, a fun and colorful nod to the uniqueness of the game, and the first Game Boy cartridge colored differently from the standard gray, paving the way for later games like the Pokemon series. The third and final Donkey Kong game for the Super Nintendo released later on in 1996. Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble featured many of the same gameplay mechanics as the first two games, but with some new elements that freshened things up. For example, new animal friends Ellie the Elephant and Perry the Parallel Bird make their debuts. Another big difference is the change-up in playable characters, with Dixie taking the lead role on this time, with her baby cousin Kiddy Kong tagging along. Kiddy Kong's unique ability is that he can bounce across open water. The two set out to free the captured donkey and Diddy from King K. Rool, this time in a new setting called the Northern Cremisphere. Cranky Kong's wife, Wrinkly Kong, returns from the second game, as does the game show host Swanky Kong. With graphics that are even more refined than the first two games, and another great soundtrack, this time provided by composer Evelyn Fisher, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble is considered by fans a fitting end to the 16-bit era of Donkey Kong. With only around 4 million copies sold, Donkey Kong Country 3 was the least commercially successful of the three games, but even this was a serious win that both Rare and Nintendo were ultimately happy with, especially considered how late the game released in the SNES's life cycle. Only a tiny handful of mainstream games came out for the system after Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, considering at this point the N64 had already overtaken it in popularity in both Japan and North America. Consider also that Sony's PlayStation had already released way back in 1994 and was rapidly gaining a massive foothold in the industry, surpassing the cutting-edge pre-rendered graphics of the Donkey Kong Country series pretty handily. All this makes the success of the game a pretty big accomplishment. All three Donkey Kong Country games would get re-releases on the Game Boy Advance in the mid-2000s, though even this wouldn't spell the final end of the Donkey Kong Country brand, but we'll get to that. And unlike the first phase of Donkey Kong's story, the third entry in this new generation didn't mean the end of a chapter. Quite the contrary, there was still plenty more to come in the 90s, even as the series moved beyond the Super Nintendo. But all good things do come to an end, and so even as we move into the late 90s and Donkey Kong ends its run on the Super Nintendo, so too does its time on the Game Boy come to a conclusion, with the fourth and final original Game Boy game releasing in 1997. Donkey Kong Land 3 once again shares level themes and environments as well as main characters with its Super Nintendo analog, but this time the game once more features a unique storyline. In Donkey Kong Land 3, Dixie Kong and her cousin Kiddy Kong set out to discover the legendary Lost World, a hidden realm said to be filled with treasures. Their adventure kicks off when they learn of a contest to find this mysterious place, putting them in direct competition with the Kremlings, led by Baron K. Ruhlenstein, who are also after the Lost World's treasures. This fast-paced, treasure-hunting tale of adventure and rivalry was a good fit for the short-term and smaller-scale nature of Game Boy games. According to Robert Harrison, the lead programmer for the second Donkey Kong Land, the reason number 3 was able to give a little bit more of an original approach with elements like its own story versus the straight-up port approach of Donkey Kong Land 2 was because the game was able to reuse the engine from the previous game for the third one, freeing up resources for some interesting changes. By all accounts, Donkey Kong Land 3 was a fine example of both a Donkey Kong game as well as a Game Boy platformer more generally. Diddy Kong Racing, one of only 2 Kong entries on the N64, began life as a completely different game called Adventure Racers, which Rare had started working on without any involvement from Nintendo. Inspired by theme parks like Walt Disney World, the idea was that players would travel around a hub-and-spoke world outside of their own vehicle, adventuring on foot in between races. Branding later evolved into a game called Pro-Am 64, evoking the NES game RC Pro-Am, which had been an immensely popular game that sold millions of copies and, along with Wizards and Warriors, was responsible for putting Rare on the map as a major Nintendo developer back then. During this phase, several colorful anthropomorphic animal characters were created, many of whom would make it into the final game, like Pipsy the Mouse and Bumper the Badger. But with the 1997 Christmas season rapidly approaching and Banjo-Kazooie being delayed until the following summer, Rare was concerned that they wouldn't have a hit AAA game ready and approached Nintendo with Pro-Am. Miyamoto liked the game, but felt that despite the NES roots, the IP just wasn't big enough to anchor a successful holiday shopping rush. He suggested rebranding the game to use a Nintendo character, and so Rare made the switch to Diddy Kong. Donkey Kong himself had been initially suggested by Nintendo, but according to Rare artist Lee Musgrave in a 2014 interview, Nintendo enjoyed the fact that we chose Diddy Kong over Donkey Kong. I think it was us trying to build on the fact that Diddy was ours and DK was theirs. Rare also took the opportunity to include Banjo the Bear as a little bit of free marketing. Conker the Squirrel made an appearance as well, ahead of his own game Conker's Bad Fur Day a few years later. The game in its final state does still incorporate those adventure elements from earlier, though you explore while still in your cart, not on foot as originally planned. Players choose from 8 different characters, each with distinct vehicles, and race across 20 tracks in 5 themed worlds. A standout feature was the ability to switch between carts, hovercrafts, and airplanes, adapting to terrain like land, water, or air, which adds strategic depth. But it's the adventure mode that really sets the game apart, where players tackle challenges, collect items, and battle bosses to progress through a story. This concept was a very unique and innovative take on the racing genre that broadened the game's appeal significantly. And of course, the 4-player split-screen multiplayer mode added some fun for friends and families to play together. An enhanced remake for the DS titled Diddy Kong Racing DS was released worldwide in early 2007. To this day, this remake is the most recent Nintendo-published game to ever be developed by Rare, for reasons we'll get to in a minute. Following on the success of Diddy Kong Racing, fans of the series were all left wondering one thing: when would the big guy himself finally make it to the Nintendo 64? They didn't have to wait too long, because 2 years later, during the holiday shopping season of 1999, Nintendo released Donkey Kong 64. Reusing their engine from Banjo-Kazooie, a breakout hit and one of the top 5 best-selling N64 games released up until that point, Rare dedicated a full 16-person development team to the project, many of whom had worked together on either the Donkey Kong Country 3 game or Banjo-Kazooie itself. The game was initially conceived as one of the major titles for the planned 64DD add-on for the N64, considering its immense scope and ambitious scale required that extra memory. However, just as they did with the Virtual Boy, Rare's management shifted strategies when it became obvious to them that the 64DD was itself not going to succeed. They ended up being right about that, and when it released in the same year as Donkey Kong 64, the add-on proved a total flop. Instead, to get around the limitations of the N64, Donkey Kong required the use of an expansion pack, one of only 2 games to do so, along with Majora's Mask. There's a contentious story behind the use of the expansion pack, as during a commentary video in 2013, Chris Marlowe, who had worked on Conker's Bad Fur Day, bragged that their team didn't need to use the expansion pack, whereas the team that was working on Donkey Kong 64 had no choice but to use it to resolve a bug before launch. According to Marlowe, this meant the game incurred a serious unplanned cost due to having to bundle the pack with the game. But lead artist of the game, Mark Stevenson, has called this story a myth, saying in a 2019 interview, "The decision to use the expansion pack happened a long time before the game shipped. In fact, we were called in by management and told we were going to use the expansion pack and that we needed to find ways to do stuff in the game that justified its use and made it a selling point. I think the bug story somehow got amalgamated into the expansion pack use and became an urban myth." Whatever the case, between the bundling of the expansion pack and an enormous $22 million marketing campaign, the game needed to sell very well in order to turn a profit. And sell well it did, beating Banjo-Kazooie by over 44% and also outselling Diddy Kong Racing, though both Kong games would maintain positions solidly in the top 10 best-selling N64 games of all time when the dust finally settled. As for the game itself, gamers and critics both agreed it was excellent. It won or was nominated for many awards, including Game of the Year awards, with critics especially appreciating the size and depth of the game, as well as the gameplay variety. The visuals were good, but when compared to the industry-changing entries on the Super Nintendo and, for some, even compared to Banjo-Kazooie, they weren't quite as striking as one might have expected. The music was similarly praised, but again only in a sort of muted way, since Grant Kirkhope's soundtrack did capture the emotion and atmosphere of the game, but just seemed to be missing that extra special something that David Wise was able to deliver on the Super Nintendo. What probably didn't help was the headliner DK rap song, which has divided fans ever since, some absolutely loving it, some appreciating it in an ironic so bad it's good kind of way, but many despising it so much that colleagues joke that the composer's gravestone will read, "Here lies the body of Grant Kirkhope. He wrote the DK rap. May God have mercy on his soul." But Kirkhope has stuck by his work over the years, and in fact when the DK rap was included in the Donkey Kong movie many years later, he actually tweeted his disappointment for not being included in the credits, saying, "I was really looking forward to seeing my name in the credits for the DK rap, but alas, as expected, it's not there. FML." The core gameplay was mostly well received, though some critics at the time noted an over-reliance on collecting mechanics, like Norman Cheeto in Next Gen, who called it an interactive egg hunt in his mostly positive review. Retrospective reviews in the decades since have been less positive and have focused more on the over-reliance on the collectathon aspect and the impact that that had on the genre. In fact, later developers such as Jonas Kerlev, creator of the Hat in Time series, have partially blamed Donkey Kong 64 for killing the 3D platformer, with Kerlev stating in 2013, "Donkey Kong 4 did a lot of things wrong, in that it was very tedious to collect everything in order to move on. A lot of people don't want that." Sadly, Donkey Kong 64 would prove to be the final Rare-developed Donkey Kong ever to be released for a home console. Despite the undeniable success of Rare's N64 Kong titles, things were pretty uncertain at the developer. Not every game was a success. Conker's Bad Fur Day, for example, underperformed despite a significant marketing budget and being widely recognized as a good game. Part of the problem was that Rare's focus on producing games of the highest possible quality meant that development budgets were pretty high for those games. And that's fine when you're producing games exclusively for the market leader with a huge market share, but with the N64 failing to match the success of the Super Nintendo, and a lack of confidence that the GameCube would do much better, Rare started to see the writing on the wall and realized it needed to make a change to ensure some stability. And so the Stamper brothers began the process of courting buyers to purchase the studio. Initially offering an outright sale to, of course, Nintendo, who remember at this point already owned a 49% stake in the company, they were surprised when Nintendo didn't immediately take the offer. Looking elsewhere, the studio ended up in a bidding war with Activision, Microsoft, and Nintendo all vying for the company's future. Recounts Microsoft VP of Game Publishing Ed Fries, "So there's a problem. If we drive a hard bargain and put in a low price for Rare, Nintendo would have the chance to buy it at that low price, and probably would, so the price was high." Ultimately, Microsoft did have the winning bid, an amazing $375 million, or 2/3 of $1 billion in 2025 dollars. This was an insane amount for a game developer in 2002, but considering Rare's track record of quality games, Microsoft figured it was worth it. When the sale went through, 3 games were in development, the first of which was Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers for the Game Boy Advance. Coconut Crackers was set to be a puzzle game that involved manipulating colored blocks on a grid to create rectangles at least 2 by 3 blocks in size. When a rectangle met the minimum size requirement, you would clear it from the grid, allowing players to progress. You also would have had the ability to switch between top-down 2D graphics and a 3D isometric view, similar to 2007's Crush for the PSP, only 6 years earlier than that. When the Microsoft deal went through and they lost the rights to the DK characters, it was rebranded It's Mr. Pants, and the one feature that set it apart, the isometric view switching, was cut from the game because the developers just couldn't get it to look right. It's Mr. Pants got average review scores and mostly faded into obscurity. Given the success of Diddy Kong Racing, a lot of people expected a franchise to result, similar to what happened with Mario Kart. As it turned out, Nintendo and Rare were thinking the same thing, and so before Rare was sold to Microsoft, they had begun working on 2 different sequels. The first was a portable kart racer called Diddy Kong Pilot. Focused on the flying aspect from Diddy Kong Racing, Diddy Kong Pilot was set to feature more characters from other Nintendo properties like the Mario franchise. The decision to focus on flying vehicles was made to set it apart from other kart racing games, though many complained still that it didn't innovate enough compared to peers such as Mario Kart Super Circuit that released for the GBA in 2001. The real standout feature for the game though would be the tilt functionality, where instead of using a D-pad, you can control your characters via tilting the Game Boy Advance left and right. This was enabled via an accelerometer that was included within the cartridge of the game. This functionality was pretty advanced and ahead of its time. So ahead of its time, in fact, that it created a lot of pain for the developers at Rare, one of whom, going by the name Jens, later commented, "We got feedback from Nintendo which pretty much covered my concerns. Tilt is not working well. A racing game with planes is pointless if you don't have a 3D world, and GBA's LCD is not well suited in situations where the GBA is not held perfectly in line with the light source, etc." Instead of doing the sensible thing of canceling the game or allowing us to drop tilt and make a game more in line with the hardware capabilities, we got scheduled to get it finished by October. To do that, we still needed multiplayer, finish off racing, and implement dozens of adventure levels that would all require individual programming. Additionally, we had several people from management micromanaging us into different directions, disregarding any hardware or cartridge space limitations. This was the Rare that Microsoft had just paid $2/3 of $1 billion for, and it would turn out there were a lot of problems like this that were just under the surface, but they would prevent the new owners from fully capitalizing on their expensive purchase. In 2011, a beta version of Diddy Kong Pilot leaked online, and you can see how similar it was to what eventually did release when all Kong references were removed and the game was rebranded as Banjo Pilot. A fully fledged home console sequel to Diddy Kong Racing was also in development for the GameCube, this one switching it up to feature the big guy himself as the main character. Announced at E3 in 2001, Donkey Kong Racing would have been pretty different because it would have involved riding around on animals instead of in traditional carts or even planes. Similar to Diddy Kong Racing, where you could flip between different types of vehicles, you'd be able to switch animals mid-race and each one would have unique abilities. After the Rare buyout, similar to Diddy Kong Pilot, Microsoft was reluctant to throw out all that work that had gone into Donkey Kong Racing, so Rare got to work trying to retool it in various ways. It took many twists and turns, and as Lee Musgrave would later comment in an interview, we decided to try and make it a little bit more like Diddy Kong Racing in terms of it being an adventure game. Then, over the course of the next 18 months or so, it went from being a track-based animal racer to a more open-world game with Tamagotchi-style features, in which nurturing your animal became a key mechanic. And so Donkey Kong Racing eventually evolved into an open-world cyber pet animal racer called Saberman Stampede, though this too would eventually be cancelled before ever being released. I have to tell you, as an executive, I hated Donkey Konga. I fought with our parent company. I thought it was going to hurt the Donkey Kong brand. Personally, I didn't find it a lot of fun to play. I pushed back hard. These are the words of Nintendo of America President Reggie Fils-Aimé in a 2022 interview, explaining how he felt about the first Donkey Kong game to release for consoles in the post-Rare era. But nevertheless, Donkey Konga did indeed come out for the GameCube in 2003 in Japan and the following year in North America. And surprisingly, it did alright. The game received generally favorable reviews by critics and fans, at least those who are interested in this genre, and were willing to give it a chance. And there's no denying Donkey Konga was a pretty innovative concept. Providing an interesting and novel peripheral to release alongside a rhythm game was something that had never really been tried on this level. Remember, this was almost a full 2 years before the release of Guitar Hero, and while other games had done similar things in the past, such as Samba de Amigo on the Dreamcast and its Maraca controllers, none of these attempts had the weight of a big franchise like Donkey Kong behind them. Players in Donkey Konga would play the bongos alongside mainly Nintendo songs like the Pokemon theme, Mario Bros theme, and of course the DK rap. It also included some famous and popular, though a little outdated, songs that most people recognize from pop culture, like Whip It by Devo and Rock Lobster by the B-52s. The PAL and Japanese releases featured their own modified track lists, and I must say the PAL version actually sort of slaps with songs like 99 Red Balloons and Tub Thumping by Chumbawamba. As Reggie put it, you know what? We launched it, and the first game actually sold reasonably well, but boy, I was not a fan. Love it or hate it, this was the state of the post-Rare era of Donkey Kong, and it would prove to be a long road back to those glory days of Rare. A long overdue follow-up to 1994's Game Boy Donkey Kong game, Mario vs. Donkey Kong came out 10 years after that hit on the next-gen Game Boy Advance. A puzzle platformer that rekindles the classic rivalry between Mario and Donkey Kong, the game has you control Mario as he rescues mini Mario toys stolen by his original arch-nemesis. Each level challenges players to locate a key, unlock a door, and retrieve a toy. Mario's diverse moveset, featuring handstands, sideways somersaults, and triple jumps, adds creativity and depth to navigation through varied environments like construction sites and lava zones. Boss battles against Donkey Kong are a highlight, requiring strategic timing to dodge attacks and strike back with objects or jumps. The game's pre-rendered graphics deliver a distinct visual flair, paired with catchy music and voice clips from Mario and Donkey Kong. In Japan, hidden e-reader support allowed access to extra levels via special cards, though this feature didn't reach North America. There was also originally going to be a feature where you could create your own levels, which was demoed at E3, but this too was cut from the final version. The game performed well anyway, eventually cracking the all-time top 40 in sales on the GBA, not too bad for a pretty simple puzzle platformer. That same year, Nintendo released a sequel to Donkey Konga on the GameCube. Featuring over 30 new tracks like Wish You Were Here by Incubus and Losing My Religion by REM, a couple new minigames, and the inclusion of some beloved Donkey Kong characters that didn't appear in the first Donkey Konga, this sequel received only average reviews from critics and did not catch on with mainstream audiences. At least the song selection was better this time, and again, Europe and Japan got their own versions. However, even with great song selections like Breakfast at Tiffany's and Enjoy the Silence on the PAL version, we at Early Epoch are gonna have to give this one to the North American version, featuring exclusives like Chevelle, Hoobastank, and Stained. Donkey Konga 2 holds the distinction of being the only game in the entire Donkey Kong franchise to get a T for Teen ESRB rating in the United States, owing to some of the lyrics of some of the songs being inappropriate for kids. Longtime Donkey Kong fans mostly found it a little fun side game that, despite Reggie's concerns we talked about earlier, took nothing away from the mainline series. After all, it's not like Nintendo was trying to get anyone to play a real Donkey Kong platformer using these silly bongo controllers, right? Donkey Kong Jungle Beat was a real Donkey Kong platformer where Nintendo tried to get people to play with those silly bongo controllers from Donkey Konga. While the game was technically compatible with the standard GameCube controller, the mechanics of the game were specifically designed to work with the bongos, so you really are encouraged to use these or else you're robbing yourself of what fun there is in the design of the game. And so, using the bongo controllers, you can have Donkey Kong slap terrain, perform backflips, swing on vines, and wall jump between different surfaces as you traverse 16 different kingdoms, each with 3 levels including one boss king level. The fairly simple plot involves defeating these 16 evil kings in order to conquer the jungle. Jungle Beat was the debut game of the new Tokyo-based development division of Nintendo, which had been created 2 years prior with a goal of bringing in fresh new developer talent that weren't willing to leave Japan's capital to move to their Kyoto headquarters. Nintendo EAD Tokyo would go on to make some fantastic games over its run, such as Super Mario Galaxy and The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask remakes on the 3DS. But this, their first ever release, unfortunately turned out to be a massive flop. It was a big disappointment for both the fledgling Tokyo division as well as the company globally, with Nintendo of America writer Nate Bildorf later commenting to MTV, "I'm still pissed that not enough people bought Jungle Beat." The game was such a flop that Nintendo would relegate DK to offshoots and spin-offs for the next 6 years while they figured out how to replicate what they lost from the Rare era. In fact, this would prove to be the final in-house home console Donkey Kong game developed by Nintendo themselves for the next 20 years until the release of Donkey Kong Bananza on the Switch 2. I should mention the game does maintain a small but dedicated group of avid supporters to this day, and it even got a re-release in 2008 for the Wii as part of the new Play Control line of GameCube ports. But before we move on from the jungle, one quick detour in an unexpected direction, because in 2005, Donkey Kong returned to the arcade with Donkey Kong Jungle Fever. Only releasing in Japan, Jungle Fever was developed by Capcom and functioned as a sequel to Jungle Beat. The game was a medal-based game, which is a genre in Japanese arcades where you basically convert cash into medallions for use in the machines and try to earn more medallions in a sort of pseudo-gambling setup. Though you can't convert the medals back into cash, so they're generally supposed to just be used to play more games. Think Chuck E. Cheese, but more adult-oriented. DK King of Swing, developed by relatively new Japanese studio Payon, is a puzzle platformer that released in 2005 for the Game Boy Advance. Inspired by the 1984 first-party Nintendo game Clue Clue, King of Swing has you swinging from platform to platform as Donkey Kong, using the L and R shoulder buttons to grab pegs with his left or right hand and rotate around them, navigating the levels. Holding both buttons charges a powerful leap to attack enemies or clear obstacles, while tapping a button releases DK in the direction he faces, adding an element of precision-based momentum gameplay. The game spans 5 worlds, with Donkey Kong retrieving Jungle Jam medals stolen by King K. Rool, and after completing the game, players unlock Diddy Kong for harder Diddy mode, with fewer health bananas and no tutorials. Visually, it adopts a cartoonish style, a serious departure from the pre-rendered graphics of previous games, which some found vibrant but others felt was honestly a straight-up downgrade. Reception of the game overall was fairly muted. First pitched as a standalone original IP, Donkey Kong was brought in to hopefully boost sales when Nintendo became involved as the publisher. But this didn't do all that much to help out the game, which ended up with fairly poor sales. This could be the result of a Donkey Kong brand that frankly had been somewhat tarnished in the years prior. It re-released on the Wii U's Virtual Console in 2014, where many got the chance to play it for the first time, and it did attract a small cult following. The final game made for the DK Bongos was Donkey Kong 3, which would also be the final Donkey Kong release for the GameCube. There isn't all that much to say about the third and final entry in the Donkey Konga series, other than it was pretty similar to the first two, but of course with some additional songs added on. This one came out only in Japan, and most of the songs were from various video games and anime shows, as well as a few J-pop hits. Interestingly, Donkey Kong Barrel Blast, which came out for the Wii 2 years later, was initially designed as a DK Bongo game as well for the GameCube, but with the relative failure of both the peripheral and the console itself, the decision was made to hold off until the next generation. Just a note on this though, as it turned out, the bongos are compatible with the Wii, and even with the Nintendo Switch and Switch 2 this many years later, and some indie games have even been designed around their use in the intervening decades. There are even some hardcore bongo fans using them to play Donkey Kong Bananza, if you can believe it, so the legacy lives on. The mid-2000s really saw the Donkey Kong brand losing steam, with just 2 games released in 2006, one of which was Capcom's arcade sequel to 2005's Jungle Fever. Reusing assets from its predecessor, the title is famous, if you can call it that, for being the only appearance so far of a special type of rainbow banana. Banana Kingdom was also the final Donkey Kong game so far to be developed for the place it all began, the arcades. The other game to come out in 2006 was the second Mario vs. Donkey Kong game, which was also the first game in the franchise to be developed for the Nintendo DS. Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2 March of the Minis continued the success of the first of these puzzle platforming spin-offs, innovating with exciting new changes like a shift to a more puzzle strategy focus and the integration of DS stylus controls. Fans also rejoiced at the inclusion of the ability to create and upload your own levels for friends to play, a feature cut from the first Mario vs. Donkey Kong. This service was available until 8 years later, when in 2014 Nintendo discontinued the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection service. The game's story revolves around the grand opening of Super Mini Mario World, with VIP guest Pauline attending the ribbon-cutting ceremony. This is actually the first Donkey Kong game featuring Pauline since way back in the original arcade game, though she did have a brief cameo in 1984's Pinball on the NES. Donkey Kong, being Donkey Kong, kidnaps Pauline, and it's up to Mario and the Mini Mario toys to reach the roof and save her. The game was a hit and became one of the top 60 best-selling games for the DS. Payon, the developer behind DK Swing, also developed the first ever Donkey Kong game for the Wii, Donkey Kong Barrel Blast. The game is set in sky-based courses using 3-dimensional navigation and has players racing with rocket-powered barrels through several different modes. There's the main mode, called Jungle Grand Prix, a single race mode, Time Trial, Free Run, and Candy's Challenges, where Candy Kong, DK's girlfriend from earlier titles, beginning with Donkey Kong Country, arranges 32 different challenges for you to complete in order to unlock the Ultra Barrel DK. The game features 17 playable characters, 9 Kongs and 8 Kremlings, and 16 different courses to race on. This game was a bit of a disaster for the franchise. The 2000s had not been overly kind to the Donkey Kong name so far, but Donkey Kong Barrel Blast really was the straw that broke the camel's back in a lot of ways. Critics hated it. IGN's Mark Bozon summarized in his review of the game, "The only thing more depressing about the franchise's move from killer side-scroller to 3D joke is the realization that this game will still sell, encouraging those in charge to continue the bastardization of a character just as old as Mario himself. We expect excellence from the Mario franchise, only to be let down time and time again by DK's fumbling franchise. Can we give this license back to Rare?" Well, Mark was wrong about one thing. The game did not sell well. As it turned out, players hated the game as much as critics. This low point in the history of Donkey Kong made Nintendo really stop to reflect about the direction they wanted to take the franchise in the future, and another home console game wouldn't come out for another 3 years. In the meantime, 3 more handheld games were released, with the first one coming out later that same year, DK Jungle Climber. This was the third and final game developed by Payon in the Donkey Kong universe. A sequel to DK King of Swing, this game was received fairly well by critics who agreed that it improved upon the formula of the first game. And that's basically the whole story with DK Jungle Climber. Those who liked King of Swing found plenty to like here, and those who didn't gave it a pass. Gameplay was pretty similar to King of Swing, apart from the addition of some new moves, new items, and new mini-games. The dual screens of the DS significantly expanding the field of play also made things a little more interesting. Considering the two games only came out via these original releases, which went by largely unnoticed, and on the Wii U Virtual Console where maybe 10 people saw them, puzzle platform lovers today might get some joy out of them in a little bit of a hidden gem sort of way. In 2008, Nintendo released their new portable console, the Nintendo DSi. You'd think that the I stands for Internet, right? The most obvious feature setting apart this new console. But in fact, it's supposed to represent an individual person and the camera functionality that was also added, along with more powerful hardware and an SD card slot. To ensure success, Nintendo obviously needed to stock this new console's DSi shop with games. Given the proven success of the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series, this one was an obvious choice, so Nintendo got to work creating the next entry, Minis March Again. Continuing and expanding on the custom level creation functionality of March of the Minis, Minis March Again became the first, but far from the last, DSiWare game to feature a level editor. Pauline makes her return once again, and once again Donkey Kong abducts her, forcing Mario to try to rescue her once more. The game was successful in not only keeping the DK brand on life support, but also in reviving opinions about the faltering DSi shop, with IGN's Lucas Thomas saying, "We were already getting disillusioned with DSiWare as a whole just a few months in." Then Nintendo announced Mario vs. Donkey Kong Minis March Again, and it fits perfectly within the smaller scope of DSiWare. Picking up and playing a level or two at a time without having to swap in a cartridge feels great. Yet another Mario vs. Donkey Kong game came out the next year. Miniland Mayhem would be the last Donkey Kong release for the DS. The game introduces a vibrant new setting, a theme park called Miniland. This fresh backdrop provides a variety of themed worlds such as jungles, haunted houses, and deserts, each with unique aesthetics and challenges. Unlike the more industrial or straightforward environments of earlier titles, Miniland offers greater visual variety and thematic depth, enhancing the overall experience. Mini Pauline toys were added, joining the existing roster of minis, and expanded gameplay included construction and level modification, making things feel surprisingly fresh compared to earlier games. Maintaining the level of quality that gamers had come to expect from first-party Nintendo titles, Miniland Mayhem was another solid entry for the DS as it approached the end of its life cycle, and went on to become the best-selling Donkey Kong game on Nintendo's flagship handheld of the era. Donkey Kong Country finally returns in 2010's Donkey Kong Country Returns. It's right there in the name. Though with a name like that, expectations were extremely high. Finally, after more than a decade in the wilderness, Nintendo was promising a return to form, a return to the golden age of the 90s. A way for fans of the series, clamoring to re-experience the magic they'd had as kids, to relive those days, or maybe even share those experiences with their own kids in a fresh new way. Nintendo veteran and producer of the game, Kensuke Tanaba, recalls, "I'll never forget April 2008. Miyamoto-san said he wanted to make a new Donkey Kong Country game and asked if there was any good possible developers for it. I suggested Retro Studios, and that's how this project began." Retro Studios is an American studio whose sole credits up till that point had been their work with Nintendo on the Metroid Prime series. Founded by Jeff Spangenberg, who had made a name for himself in the 90s as the creator of Iguana Entertainment with games like Turok, Might and Magic 3, and NBA Jam, Retro Studios had successfully revived the Metroid series with Metroid Prime, and Miyamoto knew they might just be the only ones who could pick up where Rare left off and bring Donkey Kong back to. He knew it was on the line with this game, saying to Retro's developers, "Donkey Kong is my baby, and you better get it right." Nintendo's president, Satoru Iwata, described the circumstances leading to Retro taking on the game at this particular moment as fate. And so Retro gave the game the codename Fate. They too knew what was on the line. They knew that to make this game great, they needed to balance two things well, providing a smooth and modern gaming experience, and capturing the essence of what made the original Country games so loved. So they started by spending the entire first week of development just playing the Super Nintendo games, gathering inspiration for their new Wii title. Finally, exactly 16 years to the day after Donkey Kong Country released on the Super Nintendo, it came back from the dead on Nintendo's successful 7th generation console. The adventure spans jungles, beaches, factories, and volcanoes, with the Kongs confronting the Tiki Tak tribe and their minions to restore peace and retrieve their banana hoard. These mischievous Tikis have hypnotized the island's animals to assist in stealing the bananas, forcing the Kongs to battle through diverse environments to reclaim their prize. Players control Donkey Kong, with partner Diddy controlled by AI, or, in a series first, by a simultaneous co-op partner. Wii motion controls are used for Donkey Kong's ground pounding and Diddy's blowing action. Gameplay is challenging and fast-paced, and level design is on par with anything developed in earlier games. Visuals were beautiful and engaging, and the nostalgic music of the Super Nintendo Donkey Kong Country game was mostly unchanged, with the Wii game's score comprised primarily of rearrangements of David Wise's original soundtrack. Wise himself, still working for Rare when development began, wasn't able to be involved, but Iwata and Miyamoto both insisted on keeping close to his old masterpiece. The game was a resounding triumph, selling millions of copies and perhaps more importantly, rehabilitating the good name of Miyamoto's baby, just as Retro Studios promised they would. Favoring quality over quantity this time, Nintendo wasn't in a rush to cash in on the newly revived franchise, so it was another 3 years before the next Donkey Kong game would release. This would be 2013's Mario and Donkey Kong Minis on the Move, an eShop only game that was available on the 3DS. Minis on the Move introduced many innovations to the series, like a shift to tile-based level design, a new carnival setting with diverse attractions that add gameplay variety, and an even more enhanced create and share mode. As you can tell by the name, switching from Mario vs. Donkey Kong to Mario and Donkey Kong, DK isn't the villain this time. Instead, he teams up with Pauline as a co-host of a light-hearted and fun little distraction. The following year, in 2014, Retro Studios was ready to launch the one and only Donkey Kong title for the Wii U. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze upholds the series' pivotal side-scrolling platformer legacy while introducing even more enhanced graphics and even more refined gameplay mechanics. Gameplay stays rooted in the series' tradition, featuring tight controls, treacherous levels, and many collectibles to challenge completionists. Players guide Donkey Kong and his companions, now including Dixie Kong, who brings her own abilities, through obstacles and enemies. New additions like the Kong Pow mechanic, turning foes into helpful items, enrich the experience, adding depth and variety compared to Returns. Critical reception was good, focusing on visual presentation, gameplay, and the game's stellar soundtrack, primarily composed by David Wise himself this time, making his triumphant return after leaving Rare over disagreement with Microsoft's direction. Sales were fairly good for a Wii U game, though given the console's very lackluster performance, few games of that system could truly be considered unequivocal hits. Recognizing this, Nintendo re-released the game 4 years later for the Nintendo Switch, including a new funky mode that made the game easier, making it more accessible for newcomers or casual gamers. The game was a huge hit on the Switch, more than doubling the sales on the Wii U from 4 years earlier, and proving what many already believed, that this game really was the culmination of 2 decades of passion, innovation, and vision, and as it would turn out, a fitting end to the Donkey Kong Country series. The next year, in 2015, Nintendo churned out another Mario vs. Donkey Kong game, Tipping Stars. Interestingly, coming out for the 3DS and Wii U, if you purchased the game for one system, you were given a free download code for the game on the other system. This cross-purchase concept, a first for Nintendo, was a pretty brilliant move since it seemed like a great deal for budget-minded consumers, and also encouraged some people to buy the faltering Wii U system. While the game continues the general gameplay that people had come to expect from the series, it was criticized for both its short length and for failing to innovate as predecessors had. The game felt to many like a simple rehashing or expansion pack of earlier titles. Despite some praise for graphics, soundtrack, and challenging puzzles, there just wasn't enough here that was new for the game to hit it big. The final game in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series doesn't even feature Donkey Kong in the title, and this closure to such an important chapter in DK's history is perhaps fitting because it perfectly exemplifies the way Nintendo seems to have forgotten about this character entirely in the years that followed. Though arguably not even a Donkey Kong game, Amiibo Challenge turns out to be the end of another era. There would be no slow decline this time, evolving into degrading spin-offs or subpar third-party titles. After this final entry in the long-standing handheld puzzle series, Donkey Kong would simply disappear without a trace, confined to re-releases and supporting roles in other characters' games for almost the next 10 years. But I'd be remiss not to mention Project Freedom. What's Project Freedom, you ask? Well, as it turned out, the plan was not to put Donkey Kong on a long hiatus after all. Quite the opposite. Miyamoto instead wanted an ambitious open-world 3D platformer. He'd been impressed with Skylanders developer Vicarious Visions and the way they'd handled Donkey Kong after he was included as a guest character in their most recent game, Skylanders Superchargers. The game, to be released on the Nintendo Switch, was to be focused on momentum-based gameplay and would have had unique mechanics like vine grinding using banana peels. The story was about an ecological disaster where a factory dammed a river, threatening banana trees. Favorite characters were set to return, even including a playable Pauline. The codename Freedom was inspired by the open-world nature of the game, which gave you the freedom to explore the Kong universe like never before. But with the decline and eventual failure of the Skylanders series, Activision Blizzard, who owned Vicarious Visions, made a decision to refocus efforts to prioritize their own fully owned properties like Call of Duty. The decision kinda left Nintendo in the lurch, and because they already had other big long-term projects planned and funded, it would be a long time before they could once again revive the esteemed Stupid Ape. It's April 2nd, 2025. Nintendo fans around the world gather around their TVs, phones, computer screens, Switches, maybe even homebrewed 3DSs or Wii U's, as they eagerly tune in to the most highly anticipated Nintendo Direct in a long time, maybe even of all time. Nintendo had finally officially announced the Switch 2 back in January, and they were now going to fill us in on all the details, including some games which we could expect to come out for the new system. Beginning with Mario Kart World, and then going on to details about hardware specs, and then finally moving on to some more games like Deltarune, Dusk Bloods, and Kirby Air Riders, hopes were beginning to fade for fans of Nintendo's original platforming franchise. And then it happened. Producer Koichi Kawamoto announced that this would be the last trailer of the day. As the screen faded to black and the familiar Switch snap was heard, fans waited with bated breath. Diverse and wondrous scenes fluttered by, some beautiful, some unsettling. And soon it became obvious. Donkey Kong has finally returned again. Nintendo's EPD team, the same team behind 2017's classic Super Mario Odyssey, had been hard at work for over 5 years building something truly worthy of carrying the torch of the storied franchise. And they weren't content to just build yet another bog-standard 3D platformer. Producer Kenta Motokura recognized that every big Donkey Kong iteration had come with a new big idea, saying, "The Donkey Kong series started with an arcade game created by Miyamoto-san. It featured a lot of things that were innovative for arcade games at the time, such as narrative-based gameplay and stage composition with varied design. Later on, we had success with the Donkey Kong Country series developed with Rare, and I think those titles also represented a significant innovation as Super NES games with unique visuals. So this time around, tasked with developing a Donkey Kong game ourselves, we decided we were going to aim for another big innovation." The innovation Motokura was talking about was the unique integration of voxel mechanics, enabling DK to interact with his environment in ways never before seen in a Nintendo game. The addition of other features like a skill tree makes progression feel interesting and also differentiates Bananza from traditional Nintendo titles. You can transform into various animal forms, each with unique abilities, make use of smooth and fluid movement mechanics, and find various collectibles, though not going overboard in this regard like in DK64. Platform challenge rooms and post-game challenges push platforming mechanics even further, offering extra content for dedicated players. The depth, innovation, visuals, soundtrack, characters, and even the story have all been praised by critics, longtime fans of the series, and newcomers alike, many of whom are experiencing this universe for the first time ever. As of this recording, it remains to be seen just how big a success Donkey Kong will be this time around, or how long he'll stick around. But one thing's for sure, playing this newest entry makes you wonder why he ever left in the first place. So what was your favorite Donkey Kong game? Let us know in the comments for your chance to win this one-of-a-kind DK plush, donated by my daughter in honor of our channel hitting 1,500 subscribers. That's right, all you have to do to enter to win is let us know your favorite DK game in the comments. Everyone who does this is going to be entered into a random draw that's going to take place 2 weeks from the date this video is posted. Now this was only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Donkey Kong content. We didn't even get into the various TV shows, major cameos, books, and other media that DK has appeared in over the years. These are aspects we might get into in a future video, so if you like this style of content, we would really appreciate if you consider subscribing to the channel. I want to give a huge shout out to Greenblooded395, Early Epoch's first ever member. To you and to everyone else, thank you so much for watching.